On that cold, rain-soaked evening in New York City, Evelyn Carter moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless, though beneath her composed exterior churned a sea of restless emotions. The soft clinking of glasses and polite laughter at the charity gala formed a distant backdrop as her mind raced with worries about her mother's fragile health, the hospital bills piling higher than she dared to admit. Evelyn's striking features, her luminous green eyes, full lips, and chestnut waves that tumbled over her shoulders, masked the fierce determination that had kept her going through years of hardship and sacrifice. She was a woman who had learned to smile even when her heart threatened to break, a beacon of strength for those around her. The event was more than a mere social obligation. It was her last hope to raise enough money to save the woman who had given her everything, the woman she was now desperate to save. She felt the weight of every unspoken prayer, every sleepless night etched into the lines of her delicate face. As she moved across the room, her eyes caught the reflection of a man who seemed almost unreal in the opulent setting. Hunter Lawson. The name alone carried power, whispered in hushed tones from the glittering penthouses of Manhattan to the boardrooms of Wall Street. Hunter was a young, white, handsome millionaire, CEO, with sharp cheekbones, jet black hair, and piercing blue eyes that could both captivate and intimidate in a single glance. But tonight, those eyes seemed clouded by shadows deeper than any she had seen before. Rumors painted him as a ruthless, cold-hearted businessman who cared for nothing but profits and power. Yet as Evelyn's gaze met his across the room, there was a flicker, an almost imperceptible crack in the armor he wore so well. Hunter, too, was a man broken, betrayed by someone he once trusted with everything. His heart was a battlefield of shattered dreams and unanswered questions. He wasn't searching for love, nor even companionship. He merely wanted to escape the crushing loneliness that came with being a titan of industry. But in that fleeting moment when their eyes locked, two worlds collided and a silent understanding passed between them, a shared solitude that no wealth or beauty could erase. The night wrapped around them like a velvet cloak as they found themselves drawn inexplicably together, conversations flowing with an ease neither expected, laughter bubbling up despite the heaviness in their souls. There was a spark, electric and undeniable, igniting in the space between them, a connection forged not by fate, but by the quiet desperation of two lost hearts seeking refuge. Their intimacy that night was raw and honest, not tainted by illusions or false promises. Hunter's touch was both gentle and intense, a fleeting sanctuary from the storms they each faced. Yet when dawn crept in through the grand windows, the harsh light of reality returned, and Hunter's voice cut through the fragile calm with a promise that felt like a knife. This was to be nothing more than a one-night stand. Evelyn's heart clenched, betrayal and heartbreak blooming in her chest, but she dared not show her pain. Beneath Hunter's cool exterior, however, a tempest raged. His words were meant to shield them both from deeper hurt, yet they failed to hide the regret that lingered in his every glance, the unspoken longing that gnawed at him long after she had left. Evelyn walked away that morning carrying not just the weight of her mother's illness, but also the ache of a connection that was suddenly severed. Yet within her, a tiny seed of hope took root, a hope that defied logic and whispered that maybe, just maybe, this fleeting encounter was the beginning of something far more profound. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the city waking to a new day, unaware that two souls had collided and forever changed each other's paths. Evelyn would soon discover that promises made in haste often unravel in the quiet moments between heartbeats, and Hunter would learn that sometimes the walls built to protect us only keep out the very love we crave most. As the evening's glamour faded into memory, the echoes of their encounter lingered, unseen yet powerful, fragile yet unbreakable, a silent storm waiting to break free and sweep them both into a future neither could have imagined. Evelyn awoke to an empty space beside her, the warmth of the night before already fading like breath against cold glass, and the aching silence that replaced it was louder than any goodbye. She didn't expect love, not from a man like Hunter, but a part of her, vulnerable and still tender, had hoped for something more than a vanishing act. She sat up slowly, the soft linen sheets falling away, exposing more than just bare skin, exposing the rawness of a soul left alone again. Her phone buzzed with missed calls and urgent texts, not from Hunter, but from the hospital. Her mother's condition had taken a sharp decline overnight. Evelyn rushed out, mascara smudged and heart cracked, into a world that seemed as cold and indifferent as the man who had walked away. Hours blurred into sterile hallways, quiet sobs, and conversations with doctors whose eyes were filled with too much pity and not enough hope. And just when she thought she had endured enough, a storm from her past arrived in the form of her estranged father, Richard Carter, a man who had abandoned her and her mother years ago without remorse, now demanding access to her mother's medical funds. "She's still my wife," he growled, voice laced with entitlement, as if absence could be erased by law. Evelyn stood frozen, fury simmering under her skin, trying to process how a man could return not with comfort, but with threats. She felt betrayed all over again, not by strangers, but by the man who had once called her his little girl. Meanwhile, across the city, Hunter Lawson sat alone in his glass-walled office, towering above the skyline but drowning in memories. He stared at the untouched scotch on his desk, thinking not about profits or market shares, but about the way Evelyn had looked at him, with softness and strength, not judgment. Her eyes haunted him more than he dared admit, and yet he convinced himself it was nothing more than a temporary ache. He told himself she was just another beautiful distraction in a long line of forgettable nights. But no lie is ever fully convincing when the heart is whispering otherwise. He walked through his empire like a ghost in tailored suits, the betrayal of his ex-fiancée, Tessa, still gnawing at his trust. She had pretended to love him, only to sell confidential company data to a rival, leaving him emotionally bankrupt, even as his fortune soared. And now his father, Gregory Lawson, a powerful and intimidating figure who had never tolerated weakness, was breathing down his neck again, criticizing him for losing his edge, warning him not to let another woman cloud his logic. Hunter buried his emotions under steel and silence, but the cracks were forming. Fate, however, had other plans. A new business proposal came across his desk, one involving a nonprofit hospital undergoing restructuring, a hospital that Evelyn happened to be advocating for. When Hunter arrived at the board meeting to finalize his company's donation terms, he hadn't expected her to be standing there in that same black blazer from the gala, her green eyes now colder, sharper, as if she had rebuilt her defenses overnight. She didn't flinch when she saw him. She simply nodded and carried on with her presentation, her voice calm, her poise unshaken. But he noticed the way her fingers trembled when she set down her notes. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but he didn't. Instead, he introduced himself not as Hunter Lawson, the CEO, but under the alias Daniel Hart, a decision driven by fear. Fear that knowing who he truly was would shatter the fragile ground they stood on. Evelyn noticed something familiar in his gaze but said nothing, convinced it was just her mind playing tricks. The meeting ended, tension lingering like perfume in the air, and Hunter watched her walk away, unaware that the lie he had just told would soon spin into something far more complicated. Evelyn, already burdened by her mother's worsening condition and the manipulation of her returning father, now found herself unknowingly entangled again with the man who had left her without a word. And Hunter, torn between longing and legacy, didn't realize that every step he took to protect his heart was pulling him deeper into the very fire he swore he'd never touch again. The air between them had already grown thin with secrets, but when Evelyn stumbled upon the truth, Hunter Lawson was not some anonymous investor named Daniel Hart, but the CEO of Lawson Enterprises, the same empire her hospital was fighting against for ethical violations. Her world snapped like a wire pulled too tight. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a gut punch of deception that rewrote every moment they had shared. The late-night conversation that felt genuine, the fleeting glances across boardroom tables, the gentle brush of his hand against hers, they were no longer tender memories but sharp-edged lies. She stood frozen in the hospital's administrative archives, staring at his name on a headline detailing lawsuits and cover-ups tied to Lawson Enterprises' pharmaceutical division. Her knees buckled under the weight of realization, and as tears blurred her vision, anger became her oxygen. She stormed into the next board meeting uninvited, her presence electric with fury. And when their eyes met, it was not the longing of lovers, it was war. "You lied to me," she spat, every syllable like glass in her throat. Hunter stood but didn't speak immediately, and that silence, so full of regret and cowardice, was louder than any excuse. She waited for him to deny it, to fight for the sliver of trust left, but instead he bowed, his head slightly confirming everything with the weight of his silence. The room grew cold as Evelyn walked out, not just of the meeting, but of whatever fragile connection had existed between them. Days passed like slow-moving storms. Her mother's health worsened, and with it came mounting bills, tighter deadlines, and sleepless nights filled with what-ifs. Richard, sensing vulnerability, struck harder, meeting with lawyers behind Evelyn's back, filing for control over her mother's medical decisions, and spreading rumors about Evelyn's incompetence to the hospital board. He painted himself as a concerned husband, a man of means trying to save his family, but in truth he was siphoning power, exploiting chaos for profit. Evelyn found herself cornered, not just by the man who fathered her, but by colleagues she once trusted, who now looked at her with pity or suspicion. "Maybe your emotions are getting in the way," one of them whispered when she objected to a policy change. Even her childhood friend Lila began questioning her judgment, especially when rumors surfaced that she'd been involved with the very man responsible for the hospital's current crisis. Evelyn said nothing, bottled it all, because the truth had already betrayed her once. Meanwhile, Hunter, shattered by her confrontation, found no solace in power, wealth, or the glass towers he once ruled with pride. The boardroom no longer echoed with his certainty. His assistant noticed his hesitation, his lawyer noticed his silence, and even his estranged father offered a rare warning. "Emotions make you weak, Hunter. Cut ties before they cut you." But he couldn't. Not when he replayed the look in Evelyn's eyes over and over. The hurt, the betrayal, the way her voice cracked, not from anger, but from heartbreak. He wanted to explain, to admit he'd used the false name at first to avoid bias, to see her without the shadow of his empire looming overhead. But it had gone too far, and now even his apology felt like manipulation. Their paths crossed again in an elevator weeks later. Pure coincidence, or maybe fate trying one last time. But the silence between them was no longer electric. It was suffocating. She didn't speak. He didn't beg. They stood in the small space with inches between them and miles of pain. And yet, when the doors opened and she stepped out without looking back, his fingers twitched to reach for her. Evelyn, though wounded, could not extinguish the stubborn ember inside her chest that still flickered when she thought of him. His laugh, his silence, the way he had looked at her before everything fell apart. But love, she reminded herself, cannot exist without trust, and she had already given too much of herself to men who turned away. So she walked on, unaware that Hunter had already begun unraveling his empire's secrets, determined to face the skeletons in his father's closet, not just to protect his company, but to earn a second chance with the only woman who had ever truly seen him. The months that followed were a blur of frost-bitten mornings and sleepless nights, with Evelyn burying herself in charts, patient files, and long hospital corridors that never seemed to end. Anything to keep her mind from drifting back to the man who shattered her trust. She stopped pausing in front of windows, stopped lingering in silence, afraid that the stillness might echo his name. Her mother's condition stabilized for a while, giving Evelyn a fragile sense of control. But the void inside her grew deeper, colder, and far more consuming than she cared to admit. Friends called, invitations came, but she declined them all, preferring the company of her solitude over any chance of emotional exposure. She painted on smiles during board meetings, nodded when necessary, and responded to messages with mechanical precision. Yet every step felt heavier, like her soul was walking through molasses. Hunter, meanwhile, wore his loneliness like a second skin. The penthouse that once bustled with energy became a mausoleum of regret. He'd stare at the ceiling for hours, haunted by Evelyn's voice, her eyes the way she had walked away from him without turning back. His empire remained intact, the stockholders pleased, the board pacified, but none of it mattered. He had dismantled the corrupted arm of Lawson Enterprises tied to the hospital scandal, quietly diverting funds to cover medical deficits under anonymous foundations. Yet even good deeds felt hollow without her. One stormy evening, driven by an ache he could no longer ignore, he found himself standing outside Evelyn's modest apartment building in the Lower East Side, his coat drenched, his hands buried deep in his pockets, heart pounding like a war drum. He didn't text, didn't knock, didn't dare shatter the fragile boundary she had drawn. Instead, he stood there, motionless, as the wind howled and passers-by shot him curious glances, none of them knowing he was battling something no umbrella could shield him from: regret, guilt, and the unrelenting need to simply see her silhouette behind the window. Minutes turned into hours, and still he waited, hoping she'd sense him, hoping the universe would grant him this one irrational miracle. Inside, Evelyn sipped lukewarm tea, pretending not to feel the invisible thread tugging at her heart, an instinct she'd tried so hard to silence. Her blinds remained closed, but her chest ached with the weight of something unnamed, an ache that made her restless. She paced her living room, her fingers brushing the edge of the couch where they once sat, where his laugh once filled the air. She hated how part of her missed him, how her anger hadn't completely smothered the warmth he left behind. Suddenly her phone buzzed. No name, just a notification from the security app showing an image, a man outside in the rain. She didn't need to zoom in to recognize him. Her breath caught, her hands trembling as her mind screamed at her to stay still, to not be weak, to not fall into the same trap again. But her feet disobeyed, drawing her to the window. And there he was, Hunter, soaked, unmoving, eyes fixed on the door like a ghost waiting for permission to come alive again. She could almost hear the apology in the way he stood, the desperation etched in the curve of his shoulders, the unspoken ache in the cold air that separated them. But she didn't open the door. Not yet. She needed to know this wasn't just guilt, that he wasn't here out of obligation or self-punishment. She turned away, her own tears falling silently, her heart torn between the scars he gave her and the love that refused to die. Downstairs, Hunter shifted his weight, not daring to leave, not daring to hope. And somewhere in the stillness, in the cruel quiet between them, a storm raged louder than the thunder above, one made of love, pain, and the unbearable silence of everything left unsaid. The moment Evelyn finally opened the door, her breath hitched as her eyes met Hunter's. Red rimmed from the cold, yet shining with a quiet desperation she hadn't expected. He didn't say a word at first, simply gazed at her as though seeing color after months of gray, and without thinking, she stepped aside, allowing the man who'd shattered her heart, yet somehow never left it, to step back into her world. The air was thick with tension, not the fiery kind of past arguments, but a gentler, aching kind, like two souls trying to remember how to fit back into each other's broken pieces. Inside, the dim glow of her apartment cast golden hues over their tired faces as Hunter reached for her hand slowly, reverently, like he was afraid it would vanish. And when she didn't pull away, when her fingers curled softly into his palm, the silence between them broke not with words, but with the calming certainty that something precious wasn't quite lost. They sat on the couch, close yet cautious, sipping tea neither of them tasted, the clock ticking unnoticed as Hunter spoke first. Not with excuses or promises, but truth, raw and unfiltered, about the nights he couldn't sleep, about standing outside her door replaying every word he should have said, about how losing her felt like losing his last chance at being whole. Evelyn listened, guarded at first, then slowly drawn into his vulnerability, hearing in his voice the man behind the armor. The man who hurt her, yes, but also the man who never stopped carrying her in his heart. And when it was her turn, her voice cracked as she spoke of her loneliness, her mother's fading health, and the crushing disappointment of loving someone who didn't fight. Until now. They talked about dreams long buried, wounds still bleeding, and through tears and hesitant smiles, something unspoken began to mend. Evelyn touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the sharp lines softened by emotion. And in that quiet, sacred space between two people choosing to try again, they found warmth that wasn't physical, but spiritual. The hours slipped by unnoticed as laughter returned in small waves, and Hunter, the untouchable CEO, asked if he could stay, not with urgency, but with a reverence that made Evelyn's heart ache in the best way. She nodded, and as he moved closer, there were no grand gestures, no urgent kisses, just a slow, deliberate leaning in, a forehead resting against hers, a moment of breath and trembling hearts. When their lips finally met, it wasn't fiery or rushed. It was gentle, slow, respectful, a silent vow wrapped in tenderness and trust. No clothes were shed, no boundaries crossed, only fingers interlaced under the soft light and the quiet thrum of rediscovered affection. It was the kind of night where two people rebuild what the world tried to tear apart, brick by emotional brick, glance by glance, word by word. And as the city outside hummed beneath the stars, Hunter held Evelyn close on the couch, her head on his shoulder, their hands still intertwined. And for the first time in a long time, they both felt safe, not because everything was perfect, but because they were finally choosing to face imperfection together. When morning light peeked through the curtains, it found them fast asleep, not in passion, but in peace, wrapped in the comfort of hearts learning how to beat as one again. And though no one said it aloud, the night had changed everything, not with fireworks, but with a softness more powerful than either had ever known. The morning after their quiet reconciliation, Evelyn awoke in Hunter's arms, her soul momentarily at peace, but life outside their fragile sanctuary was waiting with claws. As their days slowly filled with tenderness and mutual understanding, Evelyn found herself sinking deeper into the safety of Hunter's presence. The way his touch grounded her, how his voice steadied her storms, and how he looked at her like she was the only thing in a world full of chaos. But peace, as always, was borrowed time. One afternoon, while sorting through old legal papers from her mother's clinic, Evelyn stumbled upon something that chilled her blood: forged documents bearing Richard's name, hidden transfers of medical funds, and coded messages linked directly to Lawson Enterprises. Her breath caught in her throat, fingers trembling as the pieces of betrayal clicked into place. Her father hadn't just returned for help, he had returned to finish what he started. The man who once held her tiny hand and read her bedtime stories was now the same man trying to dismantle the life she had finally begun to rebuild. The devastation crashed through her like thunder, tearing through old wounds she had never truly healed. She rushed to Hunter, eyes brimming with disbelief and fury, clutching the evidence like it might burn her if she let go. Hunter, ever composed yet fiercely protective, took one look at the documents and his expression hardened with the kind of cold fury only betrayal could summon. But instead of lashing out, he pulled her close, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that melted her fear. "You're not alone in this," he whispered, and those words stitched something inside her that had long been torn. Together they assembled their legal team, unearthed deeper trails of corruption, and prepared to confront the man who had stained both of their lives with lies. The confrontation came on a gray Sunday, inside a quiet courthouse chamber, where Richard sat smugly behind his lawyer until Evelyn entered, her eyes no longer pleading, but blazing with purpose. Hunter followed, his presence like a storm kept barely in check. Evelyn faced her father with all the weight of a broken daughter holding the sword of truth. "Why?" she asked, voice cracking under the weight of years of love turned to ash. Richard's excuses fell like brittle leaves, his charm unable to mask the rot beneath. When the full extent of his embezzlement and corporate sabotage was revealed, silence blanketed the room. The kind of silence that precedes a reckoning. Richard's mask finally cracked, revealing a desperate man fueled by jealousy, greed, and fear of being forgotten. The justice system took over from there, but Evelyn and Hunter stood side by side, not as victims, but as survivors, woven together by shared scars and hard-earned trust. In the aftermath, Lawson Enterprises stabilized, investors renewed their faith, and the media buzzed about Hunter Lawson's resilience and mysterious partner, who helped expose the internal betrayal. But behind the headlines, there were quiet moments that meant more. Evelyn cooking dinner in Hunter's apartment, his laughter echoing through the hallways again, the way he'd touch her lower back absent-mindedly, as if anchoring himself to her presence. Yet beneath their smiles lay the memory of that courtroom day, a reminder that even love, when pure, walks hand in hand with sacrifice. Evelyn often visited her mother's grave afterward, whispering updates and holding back tears, silently thanking the universe for giving her the strength to choose love over bitterness. And Hunter, once afraid of vulnerability, now cherished every fragile, honest second with her, because he knew how quickly life could turn. Their love wasn't born out of perfection, it was born from war, from broken promises and rebuilt trust. And that, more than anything, made it real. With the chaos finally behind them and the shadows of betrayal beginning to fade, Evelyn and Hunter found themselves standing on the fragile edge of a new life. One not born of perfection, but of resilience, truth, and the quiet understanding that love must be chosen every single day. As the sun cast golden warmth over their mornings, Evelyn watched her mother slowly regain strength, her laughter returning in delicate pieces that made every struggle feel worth it, and the scent of healing herbal tea filling the apartment felt like a balm to her soul. Hunter, now freed from the shackles of his past and his father's cold legacy, had embraced vulnerability not as a weakness, but as the very root of strength. And he often stood in front of the window in quiet reflection, the city lights mirrored in his blue eyes, as if finally seeing the world not as a battlefield, but as a home. Evelyn, in turn, had begun to bloom. No longer the woman haunted by abandonment and lies, but one who had found her voice, reconciled with old friends who had once doubted her, but now stood beside her, like pillars of unwavering faith, and who saw in her not only grace but unshakable courage. The days passed like whispered promises, slow, meaningful, full of shared smiles over breakfast. Long walks through Central Park, where autumn leaves rained around them like blessings and nights spent tangled in soft blankets and open conversations, where each word stitched over old scars with gentleness. Hunter often surprised her with little things, a handwritten note left on her pillow, a bouquet of sunflowers because he remembered she once said they reminded her of her childhood summers, and Evelyn, touched by his newfound tenderness, knew this wasn't just a man trying to atone. This was a man who had changed because of love, not for it. When Evelyn was invited to speak at a women's leadership event, Hunter sat quietly in the front row, clapping the loudest, pride beaming from his face as she spoke with conviction about second chances, forgiveness, and the power of believing in your own worth. And later, as they danced slowly under the fairy lights at the after-party, surrounded by people who had witnessed their rise from ruin, Evelyn leaned into his chest and whispered, "I'm proud of you too." Their journey hadn't been clean. It had been messy, human, real, and that made it all the more beautiful. For what they had built was not a fairy tale, but something stronger, a love forged in the fire of grief and betrayal, and reborn in the quiet moments of trust rebuilt. Evelyn's mother, once frail and fading, now tended to her garden again, smiling as she watched her daughter laugh with the man who had once broken her heart, but returned not with flowers or apologies, but with consistent actions that spoke louder than any words. One evening, as the sky painted itself in streaks of lavender and rose, Hunter and Evelyn stood on their rooftop, wrapped in a single blanket, the city stretching before them like a promise. And Hunter turned to her, his voice low but certain, and said, "Sometimes the deepest wounds bring the brightest light." And Evelyn, tears glistening but not from sorrow, nodded as she whispered, "And you were my light through the storm." In that moment, they weren't two people haunted by their pasts. They were a man and a woman who had learned to heal, who had chosen each other not once, but over and over. And as they stood hand in hand, wind threading through Evelyn's hair, they weren't looking back, only forward, hearts open, souls aligned, ready to face whatever life would offer next. Not because they were unbreakable, but because they had learned that being broken together and rising anyway was the truest form of strength. And somewhere deep within, they both knew this was only the beginning of a lifetime written in the language of hope, healing, and a love that had weathered the storm and found peace.